I've been a shadow in Baek Jin-tae's penthouse for 2 years, scrubbing the scent of expensive cigars and iron-rich blood from his floors. I was the girl from Cape Town who didn't exist. Then 5 fingers clamped around my bicep in a dark alley, and suddenly the Lion of Soul finally looked at me. They thought they were sending a warning to a rival. Instead, they signed their own death warrants in the shape of a bruise on my skin. This is the story of how a hidden handprint, a silent boss, and 60 seconds of terror turned a Maid into the epicenter of an underworld war. The humidity in Seoul felt like a wet blanket, sticking my braids to the back of my neck as I rushed toward the bus stop. My shift had ended late. Jin-tae had stayed in his office until 11 p.m., his deadly calm radiating through the mahogany door like a physical weight. 2 blocks, just 2 blocks to the bright lights of the convenience store, and I'd be in the clear. I clutched my bag tighter, my mind on the remittance I needed to send home tomorrow. Behind me, the sound of a car engine idling too slowly made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't look back. I knew this city. I knew that in the shadows of the skyscrapers, things lived that didn't like to be seen. "Hey, Cece," a voice called out. The use of the Xhosa word for sister stopped me cold. It was wrong. The accent was thick, mocking, and entirely Korean. I turned, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. 3 men stepped out of a black sedan, their silk shirts unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the jagged tattoos of the Vulture Syndicate. The leader, a man with a scarred lip, stepped into the halo of the street lamp. "You're a long way from home," he sneered, his eyes tracing the line of my throat. "I'm just going to the station," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't have any money." "We don't want your won," he said, stepping into my personal space. His hand shot out, grabbing my upper arm with a strength that made me cry out. He pulled me close, his eyes scanning the discreet Beck Holdings pin on my lapel. "We want to know what the Lion says when he's behind closed doors. We want to know what he's hiding." I just clean," I gasped, trying to pull away. "I'm nobody. He doesn't even know my name." The man laughed, a dry, rattling sound, and tightened his grip until I felt the skin pinch and the muscle ache. "Well, after tonight, he's gonna know exactly who you are. You're the message we're sending to him." The penthouse atop the Beck Tower was a temple of glass and cold stone, a place where the air always felt thin, as if the oxygen itself were afraid to offend the man who lived there. For 2 years, I existed within these walls as a ghost. To Baek Jin-tae, I was not a woman with a name or a history. I was the phantom who ensured his whiskey decanters were never empty, and his floor-to-ceiling windows never bore a single fingerprint. Every morning at 5 a.m., I began my ritual of invisibility. I moved through the vast minimalist rooms with the silence of a predator, though I was the prey. I learned the topography of his life through the things he left behind, the scent of expensive sandalwood, the discarded silk ties that felt like liquid gold, and the occasional smear of blood on a porcelain sink, remnants of a world I pretended didn't exist. My rule was simple: stay out of his line of sight. When I heard the heavy rhythmic thud of his handmade Italian shoes against the marble, I vanished into the service corridors or tucked myself into the shadows of the kitchen. But sometimes I couldn't help but look. I would catch glimpses of him through the cracked door of his study, the Lion of Soul framed by the city skyline. He was always perfectly tailored, his suit jackets sharp enough to draw blood. He was a man of deadly calm, a predator who didn't need to roar because his silence commanded the very gravity of the room. He would sit there for hours, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his whiskey eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he were calculating the exact moment the world would fall into his lap. There were moments when I felt the weight of his gaze drift toward the reflection in the glass, and my heart hammered against my ribs. I was a South African immigrant with a temporary visa and a family home counting every cent I earned. He was a god of the underworld. In this house, I was less than the dust I polished away. I took pride in that invisibility. I wore my silence like armor, believing that if he never truly saw me, the violence of his world could never touch me. I stayed in the margins, a ghost scrubbing the edges of a monster's life, never realizing that a ghost is only safe until the monster decides to reach out and grab it. I didn't know that while I was watching the floor to avoid his eyes, he had been memorizing the sound of my footsteps all along. The humidity of the Namdaeman market usually felt like a comfort, a chaotic symphony of sizzling street food and shouting vendors that drowned out the lonely silence of the penthouse. But tonight the air felt heavy, curdled by the scent of ozone and approaching rain. I clutched my bag of groceries to my chest, my mind tallying the cost of the produce against the remittance I needed to send home to my mother. I was 3 blocks from the safety of the subway when the world tilted. A black sedan swerved toward the curb, its tires screeching against the asphalt like a dying animal. Before I could scream, 2 men emerged from the shadows of a nearby alley. They didn't move like the street thugs I'd seen in movies. They moved with the coordinated, terrifying efficiency of soldiers. A heavy hand clamped over my mouth, the leather of a glove tasting of salt and old smoke. I was hoisted off the ground, my groceries spilling onto the wet pavement, a burst of red tomatoes crushed under a polished boot. I was shoved into the back of the car, the door slamming shut with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. Minutes or hours passed. Time becomes a fluid, terrifying thing when you are blindfolded, before I was shoved into a chair in a room that smelled of damp concrete and motor oil. When the blindfold was ripped away, the harsh glare of a single bulb burned my retinas. "You're the shadow that cleans the lion's den," a voice rasped. A man with a jagged scar across his lip leaned into my space, his breath smelling of bitter coffee. He was a vulture, his collar turned out to reveal the scorched tattoo of a bird of prey. "Tell us, Naledi, when does Bei Jin Tae leave the tower without his detail? When is the glass thinnest?" I felt a cold shiver of terror, but beneath it, a strange, stubborn spark flared. For 2 years I had been a ghost to protect myself. Now they wanted me to be a weapon. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I am just a maid. I look at the floor. I don't see his schedule." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. He reached out, his hand wrapping around my upper arm with a strength that made the bone groan. He squeezed, his fingers digging into the soft muscle, anchoring me in place. "Don't lie to me. A ghost sees everything because no one bothers to hide the truth from it." He leaned closer, his grip tightening until I felt the skin beginning to bruise beneath his thumb. "Tell us his routine, or we'll send you back to him in pieces." I looked into his cold, dark eyes and thought of the deadly calm of the man back at the penthouse. Jin Tae was a monster, but he was my monster. He had never touched me. He had never even looked at me. To betray him was to lose the only scrap of safety I had left in this city. "I have nothing to tell you," I spat, the words tasting like iron. The man's face hardened. He didn't hit me, not yet. Instead, he let his hand linger on my arm, the pressure of his fingers marking me, branding me with a signature of violence that I knew, even then, I could never hide. The walk back to the penthouse was a blur of rain and adrenaline. I had pulled my cardigan down, the fabric scratching against the fire that bloomed on my upper arm. My heart didn't stop racing until the elevator doors hissed shut, ascending to the silent sanctuary of the top floor. I was late, and in Bei Jin Tae's world, lateness was a crack in the foundation of his meticulously ordered life. I didn't go to my room to cry. I went straight to the kitchen. My hands trembled as I prepared his midnight tea, a specific blend of oolong that required precise temperatures. I used the steam to hide the moisture in my eyes, my breath hitching as I felt the dull throb of the bruise beneath my sleeve. It felt heavy, a leaden weight that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. I entered his study with the practiced silence of a shadow. The room was dark, lit only by the amber glow of the city skyline and the soft light of a single desk lamp. Jin-tae was motionless, silhouetted against the glass, his back to me. The deadly calm he radiated felt different tonight, sharper, more concentrated. "You're late," he said. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards. "I apologize, sir. The rain," I whispered, keeping my head bowed. I set the tray down on the edge of his desk, my fingers fumbling with the porcelain cup. As I reached across to place the saucer, the sleeve of my cardigan caught on the corner of a heavy crystal paperweight. It snagged, sliding upward just a few inches, but in the sterile silence of the room, the movement felt like a scream. The purple-black signature of the vulture's grip was exposed, a jagged five-fingered mark stark against my skin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to pull back, to hide the shame of my vulnerability, but a hand, larger, warmer, and infinitely more powerful, shot out and caught my wrist. Jin-tae didn't stand up. He didn't shout. He simply sat there, his fingers like iron bands around my pulse point, staring at the mark on my arm. The temperature in the room didn't just drop, it turned to ice. The very air seemed to crystallize, becoming too sharp to breathe. He didn't look at my face at first. He traced the edge of the bruise with his thumb, his touch so light it was terrifying. When he finally tilted his head up, his whiskey eyes were no longer amber, they were a dark, bottomless void. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't look through me, he looked at me. "Who," he whispered, the word carrying the weight of a death sentence, "touched what belongs to me?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't even tremble. I was caught in the center of a storm that had finally found its target. The silence that followed Jin-tae's question was more deafening than any explosion. He didn't let go of my wrist. Instead, he guided my arm closer to the lamp's glow, studying the bruising as if he were memorizing the exact pressure points used by the man who had dared to mark me. His breathing was slow, rhythmic, and utterly terrifying. "You asked me a question, Naledi," he said, his voice dropping to a velvet rasp that made the hair on my neck stand up. "The vultures," I choked out, the name feeling like a curse in the stillness of the room. "They wanted to know your schedule. They wanted to know when you were vulnerable." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but there was no warmth in it, only a predatory satisfaction. He finally released my wrist, his hand reaching for the sleek black phone on his desk. He didn't stand up, he didn't pace, he remained seated in his leather throne, the city lights shimmering behind him like a crown of cold fire. He pressed a single button. "Secretary Choi, come in, bring the captain of the guard." Moments later, the heavy doors slid open. 2 men, hardened veterans of the Seoul streets, who usually carried themselves with an air of untouchable arrogance, stepped into the room. They stopped 3 paces from the desk, their eyes darting to me, then to the bruise now visible on my arm as I clutched my cardigan. They saw the ice in Jin-tae's gaze, and for the first time, I saw true fear on their faces. Jin-tae didn't raise his voice. He leaned forward into the light, his hands folded neatly on the mahogany surface. "A man entered my territory," Jin-tae whispered, the sound so low the lieutenants had to lean in to hear him, their bodies rigid with tension. He looked at Secretary Choi, his eyes narrowed to slivers of dark glass. "I want the vultures' gambling dens in Gangnam closed by dawn, not by the police, by fire. I want every man associated with the interrogation of Miss Mokowene brought to the basement of the shipyard. Do not kill them. I want them to wait in the dark until I arrive." "Sir," the captain stammered, his voice trembling with fear, "the vultures are backed by the Japanese conglomerates. If we move this aggressively, it means total war."
Jin-tae finally stood, smoothing the front of his $10,000 suit with a terrifying surgical precision. He walked around the desk until he was inches from the captain's face. He didn't scream, he didn't strike him. He simply leaned in and breathed a single command.
Then let the city burn. Start with the hand that touched her. The men bowed so low their foreheads nearly hit the floor before they scrambled out of the room. Jin-tae turned back to me, the deadly calm still radiating from him like a physical heat. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from my face, a silent promise of a protection that was far more dangerous than the threat I had escaped. The servants' quarters had always been my sanctuary, a small, windowless room that smelled of lavender and laundry detergent. But that night, Jin-tae didn't allow me to retreat to my shadows. He placed a hand on the small of my back, his touch firm and possessive, and guided me toward the private wing of the penthouse, a place I had only ever entered to polish the heavy oak doors. He led me into a suite that was a cathedral of ivory silk and dark wood. The floor was covered in a rug so thick it swallowed the sound of my footsteps, and the air smelled of his sandalwood cologne. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a velvet armchair. I sat, feeling small and out of place in my stained uniform. I expected a doctor or a nurse to appear, but Jin-tae returned alone, carrying a silver basin of warm water and a first aid kit. My heart hammered against my ribs as the most feared man in the city knelt on the floor between my knees. He didn't look like a mob boss in that moment. He looked like an artist preparing a canvas. He rolled up my sleeve with agonizing slowness. When the purple handprint was fully exposed, his jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in his cheek, the only sign of the rage boiling beneath his calm. He dipped a soft cloth into the water and began to clean the scrapes on my forearm. "I've known the sound of your breathing for 730 days, Naledi," he whispered, his voice a low melodic hum that vibrated in my chest. "I've known that you take your coffee black at 4 a.m. when you think no one is watching. I've known that you hum songs from your home when you scrub the floors in the East Wing." I gasped, my eyes widening. I had spent 2 years believing I was a ghost, a clever phantom who had successfully evaded his notice. "You thought you were hiding, Naledi," he continued, his whiskey eyes locking onto mine, burning with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He took a vial of expensive ointment and began to massage it into my bruised skin. His touch was incredibly gentle, a jarring contrast to the violence he had just promised the world. "You touched her to get to me because they realized what I had realized months ago. You are my only silence, and they will die for trying to break it." In the gilded quiet of the room, I realized my invisibility had never been a shield. It had been an invitation. I wasn't his maid anymore. I was his obsession. The days that followed were a blur of silk sheets and the distant, muffled sound of a world being torn apart. I was a prisoner in the master suite, though the bars were made of 5-star meals and the finest medical care Seoul could provide. Jin-tae was rarely there, but his presence was a constant, suffocating weight. Every hour a new report reached the penthouse, not in words, but in the shifting atmosphere of the city below. From the floor to ceiling windows, I watched Seoul's skyline as if it were a game board Jin-tae was tilting until every piece he didn't like slid into the abyss. By the second night, the vulture gambling dens in Gangnam weren't just closed, they were blackened husks. The news spoke of electrical fires and unfortunate industrial accidents, but I knew better. I knew the deadly calm had finally broken, and what followed was a surgical erasure. Jin-tae didn't fight a war with shouting and chaos, he fought it like a ghost. Supply chains for the rival syndicates simply vanished overnight. Their bank accounts were frozen by phantom keystrokes. Their lieutenants were found in the early morning fog, not dead, but broken in ways that ensured they would never hold a weapon or a woman's arm ever again. He was dismantling them brick by brick, heart by heart. On the third night, he returned to the suite. He didn't smell of blood. He smelled of cold winter air and that same haunting sandalwood. He didn't speak as he loosened his tie, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked over to where I sat by the window and knelt, just as he had before. Without a word, he reached for my arm. The bruise had faded to a sickly yellow, the edges blurring into my skin. He traced the faint outline with a finger that trembled almost imperceptibly. The underworld was paralyzed, the vultures were screaming for mercy, and half the city was in flames. Yet here he was, obsessed with the fading ink of another man's sin on my body. "They are almost gone," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged rasp in the quiet room. "The man who held you, I saved him for last. I wanted him to watch his world turn to ash before I showed him what it feels like to be touched by a monster." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the abyss. He wasn't just protecting me, he was terraforming the entire city into a place where I could never be hurt again, regardless of the cost in lives or gold. I wanted to be seen, but as the smoke of his purge rose over the horizon, I realized being the focus of Bei Chin-tae's gaze was a responsibility that could crush a person just as easily as his enemies. The penthouse was silent, save for the low hum of the climate control and the distant muffled pulse of the city he had just brought to its knees. I stood on the balcony, the cold air biting at my shoulders, watching the red and white lights of Seoul's midnight traffic. I heard the glass door slide open behind me, the familiar, heavy grace of his movement. He didn't speak, he simply stood beside me, his hands resting on the cold steel railing. "You should be inside," he said, though there was no edge to the command. "The air is turning." "I spent my life in the sun," I replied, my voice thin against the wind. "The cold makes me feel like I'm still awake, like this isn't just a dream I'll wake up from back in the servants' quarters." Jin-tae turned to look at me. The deadly calm was there, but the ice in his eyes had thawed into something more transparent, something raw. He reached out, not for my bruised arm this time, but for my hand. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip shielding my fingers from the chill. "Is that what you think this is? A dream?" asked he. "I think I am a maid who saw too much," I said, finally meeting his gaze. "I think I am a liability you are cleaning up just like you clean up the rival families. You're protecting your territory, Jin-tae. I am just a part of that territory." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, a short, jagged sound of disbelief. He stepped closer, closing the distance until the scent of sandalwood and winter air enveloped me. He took my face in both of his hands, his thumbs brushing against my cheekbones with a reverence that terrified me more than his rage ever could. "I have spent 10 years building a world where nothing can touch me," he whispered, his forehead leaning against mine. "I have killed men for looking at me the wrong way. I have burned empires for a percentage of a profit. But for 3 days, I haven't thought about the port or the vultures or the money. I have only thought about the way your breath hitched when that man grabbed you." His hands were trembling. The lion of Seoul, the man who paralyzed the underworld with a whisper, was shaking because of a girl who used to scrub his floors. "You are not an asset," he said, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that felt like a secret he was surrendering. "An asset can be replaced. An asset can be sold. You are the only thing in this world that makes me want to be a man instead of a monster. I'm not protecting my territory, Naledi.
I'm trying to keep my soul from bleeding out. In the gilded quiet of the room, I realized the bridge between us, forged in blood and silk, became real. I realized that the deadly calm wasn't just a weapon he used on others, it was the mask he used to survive, and he had just taken it off for me.
The piece of the bridge we had built lasted only as long as it took for the elevator's security chime to scream. The sound was a jagged tear through the silk-lined quiet of the penthouse. Downstairs, the vultures had stopped playing by the rules of shadows. This wasn't a tactical move, it was a suicide run. The desperate dying thrash of a beast Jin-tae had backed into a corner. "Get behind the desk," Jin-tae commanded. The vulnerability I had seen on the balcony vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, lethal focus that seemed to pull the light from the room. The heavy oak doors of the study exploded inward. 3 men burst through the smoke, their faces masked, their weapons raised. I dived for the floor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the plush carpet. I expected the sound of a gun, but what I heard was something much worse, the sound of a predator finally allowed to hunt. Jin-tae didn't flinch. He moved with a speed that defied his tailored elegance, a blur of shadow and steel. He caught the first man's wrist, the snap of bone echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. He didn't just disarm the intruder, he dismantled him. There was no hesitation, no mercy, only a terrifying, deadly calm efficiency. He used his environment like a weapon, the heavy crystal paperweights and the edge of the mahogany desk becoming instruments of a brutal final justice. From my place on the floor, I saw the blood spray across the white silk wallpaper. I saw the man I had shared a moment of tenderness with turn into the monster the stories warned about. His eyes were wide, dark, and utterly devoid of the warmth he had shown me moments before. The last man standing, the one with the scarred lip who had marked my arm, lunged with a serrated knife. Jin-tae caught his blade hand mid-air. For a second, they stayed locked in a gruesome dance. Jin-tae leaned in close, whispering something I couldn't hear, a final rites intended only for the dying. Then, with a single sickening twist, he forced the man to the ground. Jin-tae stood over him, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding onto the ivory rug. He looked down at the vulture, then slowly turned his head toward me. He looked like a demon birthed from the very shadows I used to hide in. I knew in that moment that I should run. I should take the flight home and never look back at this world of blood and silk. But as our eyes met, I didn't see a monster. I saw the man who had burned a city to keep me whole. I didn't stay on the floor. I stood up, my legs shaking, but my heart set. I walked through the wreckage and the red stains, reaching out to take his bloodied hand in mine. I wasn't a maid, and I wasn't a ghost. I was the anchor for the man who had destroyed everything for me. "It's over," I whispered, my fingers lacing through his. "Jin-tae, I'm still here." The morning sun broke over the Seoul skyline, not with the harsh glare of a city under siege, but with a pale golden clarity that felt like a beginning. Inside the penthouse, the glass had been replaced and the blood scrubbed away, but the silence was different now. It was no longer the hollow quiet of a tomb. It was the heavy, expectant stillness of a throne room. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite, staring at a woman I barely recognized. The gray polo shirt and the aprons of my former life were gone, replaced by a gown of midnight blue silk that felt like water against my skin. The back holdings pen I once wore as a badge of service was gone. In its place, a heavy diamond pendant rested against my collarbone, a cold reminder of the price of protection. I reached up, tracing the faint yellow mark on my arm. It was almost gone, but the memory of it was etched into the foundation of who I had become. The door opened, and Jin-tae entered.
He was dressed in a charcoal suit, his deadly calm restored, though his eyes softened the moment they found my reflection. He didn't approach me as a master or a savior. He walked to me as a partner, stopping just behind me to rest his hands on my shoulders. "The accounts are settled," his voice said, a low, resonant hum. "The debt your family carried is erased. The men who touched you are no longer a part of this world's history. You are free, Naledi. There is a car waiting to take you to the airport, and enough wealth in your name to ensure you never have to see a shadow again." I looked at him through the glass. "And if I don't want to go back to being a ghost?" He didn't answer immediately. He turned me around to face him, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "If you stay, you are no longer invisible. You will be the heart of this organization, the only weakness I am willing to show the world. It is a life of peril. Every man who fears me will look at you and see a way to hurt me." I thought of the long months of scrubbing floors and the terror of the market alley. I thought of the bridge we had built on the balcony and the way he had looked at me when his hands were red of my enemy's blood. In this city of millions, I had finally been found. To leave would be to return to a world where I didn't exist. "Let them look," I said, my voice steady, my hand covering his. "I survived the vultures. I think I can survive being yours." Jin-tae bowed his head, a silent, profound gesture of surrender. He led me toward the elevator, but we didn't go to the service entrance. We walked through the main foyer, the guards bowing low as the doors slid open. As we stepped out into the light, I wasn't walking 3 blocks to a bus stop. I was walking beside the Lion of Seoul, no longer a maid in his house, but the queen of his empire. The city was the same, but the girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew that the most dangerous love wasn't the one that kept you safe, it was the one that made you worth burning the world for.